All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our program tonight. My name is Paige Ladozinski. I am the president of Cultural Connections, and we are so excited to welcome you to this program this evening. Tonight's program is called Fair Pay in a Time of Crisis, Fighting for Wage Equity and Transparency in Museums. So a really important and engaging topic. And I just want to thank both our speakers and our Cultural Connections board members who worked really hard to plan this program tonight. So just a very quick overview of Cultural Connections. We are a community of Bay Area museum, arts, and culture professionals who meet regularly to exchange ideas, share resources, and inspire creativity. We offer programs and networking events, and we're excited to continue this year's series of virtual programs between now and May of 2021, and looking forward to resuming future programs in person when we're able. I wanted to give a shout out to our next program, which is tentatively scheduled for January 28th. That will be about online engagement. So stay tuned for email updates, follow us on social media, and check back on our website to learn a little bit more about registering for that program. And while many of us are logging in from all over, I also wanted to mention that since Cultural Connections is based in the Bay Area, we acknowledge that those of us in the Bay Area are on the ancestral lands of the Ohlone people, and if anyone would like to offer another land acknowledgement, please feel free to do so in the chat from where you're logging in from. Lastly, I wanted to give one more thank you in particular to CC board members Amy, Jessica, Nalini, and Morgan for helping plan this program. And I will now turn it over to our board member Morgan, who will introduce our panelists and kick off the program in more detail. So thank you all attendees, and thank you, Morgan.
All right, thank you, Paige. Hello, everybody, and thank you again for joining us today for our panel on wage equity in museums. My name is Morgan Schlesinger, and I am a board member for Cultural Connections and a member of the program team that organized this event. Before we get started, I want to quickly go over our program schedule. Once I introduce the panelists, I will moderate the initial discussion for about half an hour. And during this time, we encourage you to leave questions you have for our panelists in the chat. My fellow board member Nalini will be collecting your questions there. Once we conclude the moderated portion of the event, Nalini will lead an audience Q&A for about another 30 minutes. And after that audience Q&A at around 5:30, we invite you all to join our panelists in breakout rooms. There you will have the opportunity to ask additional questions until we reconvene at 6 o'clock to conclude the program. Later on in the panel, you will have the opportunity to let us know which breakout room you would like to join. So one of our main goals for this panel is to really break down the social barriers that loom over salary discussions. And if nothing else, we want you to come away from this event feeling more empowered to discuss with each other the wage inequities many of us experience in the museum field. And while we were organizing this panel, we were all particularly inspired by the Google Sheet that went viral a couple years ago that let museum workers anonymously share their position and annual salary. It made it easier than ever before to compare your salary to others in the field. And it really got us thinking about, what the next step in this conversation would look like for us. And we realized that in order to have an honest conversation about wage inequity, we ought to be more transparent with our friends and colleagues about what it is we actually make. So with that said, as an icebreaker to kick things off, I'd like to invite everyone, our panelists included, to share their position and annual salary in the chat. I myself am the collections manager and registrar at the Day Museum, and I make $44,000 a year working 26 hours a week. Now, just to be clear, you do not have to share this information if you do not want to. We know this is taboo for a lot of people, so please, please, please do not feel obligated or pressured. And also know that although this panel is being recorded, the chat will not be included in the recording or otherwise saved or shared. Regardless though, we hope that this activity illustrates not only the diversity of compensation in the field, but also how many of us face similar uphill climbs towards achieving a living wage. All right. Looks like we're getting, thank you all for participating. I know this is a big ask. Okay, good. So thank you to everyone who decides to participate in this. I know it's not easy, but as our panelists can attest, breaking down this social norm can go a long way in solving inequities in the workplace. And that's what you all are really here for. So without further ado, let's introduce our panelists. First, we have Lauren Girard. Lauren is the Director of Visitor Experience for the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures, covering everything from hiring, training, and development of visitor experience associates to creating access and inclusion initiatives. Prior to joining the Academy Museum, she opened the Broad Museum in downtown LA, where she developed their acclaimed visitor services program. We also have here today Cody Machado. He is a labor organizer, youth educator, and teaching assistant at the New Children's Museum in San Diego. Cody and his colleagues at the museum have recently unionized, and he currently serves on the teaching art team in contract negotiations alongside the rest of the volunteer organizing committee. And finally, we have Nat Kramm, an overworked and underpaid frontline museum worker, community organizer, and artist in San Francisco. They created the Seize the Museums blog as a platform to explore, celebrate, and critique museums for all the good, bad, and the ugly. Thank you again for being a part of this discussion, and with that, we can all get started. So I guess to kick things off here, if you could each tell us a bit about yourself, what wage equity means to you, and what experience you have advocating for wage equity in the workplace. And I thought, Nat, if you would like to start us off with this, that'd be great.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. My name's Nat Kramm. I'm a guest services associate at a museum here in San Francisco, and I make $16.25 an hour. And I also run a blog called Seize the Museum that addresses some of the systemic failures that wage disparity, ableism, sexism, racism that I personally see in the museum field. I would definitely characterize it as very critical, but it comes from a place of love. I'm sure many of y'all can relate to that sentiment. So the blog was kind of born out of my perspective as a frontline museum worker, making just barely above San Francisco minimum in one of the most expensive cities in the world. Being a museum studies student in this weird liminal space between getting my undergrad degree and now weighing the pros and cons of shelling out a ton of money I don't have for a master's degree in the middle of a global pandemic. But probably most of all, taking the lessons that I've learned as a community organizer and applying them to the museum world. During the pandemic, I've made a lot of incredible connections over social media and also locally with museum workers and advocacy organizations, art and activist collectives, mutual aid networks, and museum unions across the country and even abroad, both established and in the process of forming. I think when so many of us have lost our jobs, there's obviously a lot of despair there, but there's also this overwhelming sense of revolutionary optimism present that imagines what museums could look like if they existed in a society that puts people before profit, where workers really have a say in how things are run. I think a lot of workplace organizing has been severely hampered in many ways by the pandemic. We're not even allowed to be in the same room with each other, really. But it's also exposed so many of the inequalities and oppression of working class people. And it's really easy to forget how much power we really do have as workers. And ultimately, we don't need the bosses need us. And now is the perfect time to demonstrate that power.
Great, thanks, Nat. Cody, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to see you all here. My name's Cody Machado. I'm a teaching artist at the New Children's Museum down in San Diego. And like Morgan said, I'm also part of the volunteer organizing committee that has helped to organize the museum into the unionized environment we have today. So my experience advocating for wage equity is really focused in that experience, A lot of this started for me just by having simple conversations with my coworkers and kind of seeing, like Nat said, like those inequalities in the workplace. And we all kind of agreed, like, there's something wrong here. I feel like in every workplace we've all been in this industry, like it's the same kind of thing over and over and over again. And it kind of felt like the definition of insanity, you know, doing the same thing over and over and over again, expecting a different result. Just going to a new job, hoping it'll be better. It looks great on the front. Like I love the mission of the, you know, place I work at. And then you get there and there's kind of the same institutional issues there. And that is really what drove me and my friends and coworkers to exercise our right as American workers to unionize. And so a lot of that for me has been, like I said, really talking with my coworkers and kind of seeing what those things are. You'll kind of see through all of this, a big point I'll come back to is conversation and like talking with each other. But yeah, and for me, my work has been pretty significantly affected because once COVID hit, it forced us to close our doors like a lot of other institutions. And that led to a lot of furloughs and layoffs, which forced us to switch gears in our advocacy, you know? So originally it started, we were really focused on just the main, like writing of the contract, ratifying a contract, coming to an agreement. And, you know, once COVID hit, we really had to stop and go, okay, what's important now? Well, we need to help coworkers who are out of work. So we set up mutual aid funds to help those people. And we also had to switch gears in negotiations as well and start talking with our bosses about, well, what is an equitable way for people to be laid off? Like, what is an equitable way for furloughs to happen? What is an equitable way for people to be brought back once they can be brought back and you need those workers again? And so I think for me, wage equity is a pretty straightforward concept, right? It's really just getting paid a fair amount for the work you do. But I think that's really just a smaller part of workplace equity. I think there's a lot of interconnecting pieces here, and kind of the way to overcome a lot of this is, you know, sitting down and talking about it and like, why is this the way it is? Well, how do we address that? And so that's what I hope to speak to you about today.
Awesome. Thanks, Cody. And last but not least, Lauren.
Okay. So I think for me, you know, one of the things that really struck me as I've been kind of going through the museum process is that like I actually wound up taking a pretty substantial pay cut to get into the field of museums. I came from frontline retail. Like that's really concerning to me that, you know, a museum position was paying about 25% less than what I had been making as, you know, an assistant retail manager. So I think, you know, one of the things that I think I really want to focus on advocating for is thinking about your frontline teams in particular. As you know, I'm the director of visitor experience, and I think, you know, back to Nat's point when she said, or when they said the, you know, bosses don't need us, or bosses don't need them. That is absolutely 100% accurate. And I think, you know, you guys who do work the front lines, who are the face of the museum, who are interacting with guests, with visitors, we really don't have a museum without you. We've got a collection of objects, and that's very, very different. So I think, you know, one of the things that I would love to have people take away from this is that you guys have more power, especially in numbers, than I think some people realize. And then I think, you know, going into how work has been impacted by COVID, I'm lucky enough that I work in a museum that has not opened yet. So our impacts in terms of COVID have actually luckily been pretty minimal. The organization I work for, the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures, has been really great about making sure that everyone is whole during the pandemic, that nobody has been laid off or furloughed. In fact, they actually have been giving a little bit of a stipend to everyone once a month to cover increases in our bandwidth. So everyone who's able to work from home is working from home. And I think that really kind of opened my eyes a little bit also to how we could be doing things differently and looking for other ways that we can be as equitable as possible across the board. So I am very much looking forward to digging into this with you guys later on today.
Thanks, Lauren. So I think one of the main themes that we hear is really how to get the conversation going. So Cody, I'm gonna have you start with this first question, and then Lauren and Nat, you can chime in after with additional thoughts. But what strategies can museum workers use to build a safe space which they can discuss wage transparency at their institutions?
Yeah, so my number one recommendation is always just don't feel intimidated. I know that there can be a lot of social pressure in kind of a work scenario, like Morgan said earlier, it can be taboo to talk about how much you get paid. And I think a lot of what holds people back is that kind of social restriction there. And we have to remember at a certain point, that chain doesn't really exist. And it really is just kind of an internalized fear of what will happen, you know? So a great way of building a safe space for yourself is start to take up space. If you're in an environment that you like and you want to make better, you need to start taking up space for yourself and making room for yourself and just having those conversations openly. My number one kind of caveat to this would be, you always want to kind of grow how comfortable you are in a situation like that. So I wouldn't go right up to your boss maybe and start telling them how you feel like you're underpaid, but start with your coworkers. It's really easy to talk with your coworker and go, I think everybody can relate. We all have those little conversations on the side with a coworker where, we start griping about things and be like, oh, well, this is what's wrong. Like, this is what's going on. Like, this is what we could do. And I think the important thing there is to really listen to them and go, what do you think we should do? How would you do that? And start kind of picking each other's brains about what are solutions to these issues. Because it's a lot easier to come up with a solution and, try to present that to get that put in place and kind of bring that up to the next level, than just going straight up to your boss and being like, this is what's wrong. You know what I mean? So taking up space and starting in kind of a smaller, more comfortable area and working your way out and kind of growing the conversation.
Yeah, can I tag into that really quick? So I think also some institutions, and I'm not saying that this is all institutions, but I think some institutions really take advantage of opacity when it comes to this kind of stuff. I think there are a lot of people who really don't understand or have never been told outright directly what their rights are when it comes to talking about wage. So the polite fiction that it's rude to talk about money only tends to benefit people who already have money. It's something that is very evident to me that we actually as managers are not able to say legally. We cannot discourage employees from talking to each other about salary. The exception to that is if you're a supervisor, et cetera, et cetera. But if you don't have any supervisory situations, there's nothing preventing you from talking to each other about how much money you make. And I also agree that I think sunlight's the best disinfectant. I think the more people get comfortable talking about how much money they make, the more that you can really dig into any sort of systematic issues around pay. So is it that white women tend to be paid more in museums? If everybody who's a white woman in your museum is making more than people of color or making more than men, something like that, that's something that's worth knowing. And you really won't know that necessarily unless you dig into it. And it's also something that a lot of managers just don't necessarily go through training about this. I have been very lucky that I've worked for companies that have provided a lot of pretty extensive training when it comes to that, but not everyone does.
Yeah, just to add, there's an inherent risk in doing this. There's no such thing as a completely safe space to do this, right? Even being a part of this panel for me is a calculated risk that I'm taking. The risk of retaliation is a real thing. Even in California, where we have comparably pretty robust worker protections in terms of being fired, they can find other ways, if you pose a serious threat. So be smart. my boss might be tuning in right now, which is kind of scary, not gonna lie. But the reason we do this is not so we can just individually get a raise or a promotion or whatever. It's to benefit everyone, to make a better, fairer working environment where workers are valued and compensated accordingly for that value. So that's not to discourage you, just be smart about it, use discretion, choose to start with a small group of trusted people and build from there. And if you need to utilize anonymity in like the transparency process, that's always something that we can do. But you're always assuming some amount of risk, but that's why we do it, right? The reward is worth it.
Absolutely. And maybe to add on to that a bit, Nat, do you think you could speak a bit more to, if you do start to receive pushback from management, what should the next steps be for people to, not let this issue go?
Well, certainly there's power in numbers. You need to be talking to your coworkers, let them know what's going on. There is obviously a built-in vehicle called human resources. That is, it's supposed to be their job to deal with these things and make sure that retaliation isn't happening. But human resources is not, a neutral body. They work for the museum. So keep that in mind. But yeah, power in numbers. If you need to go to HR, if you go as a group, you have a lot more power. So get some good people behind you and stick. And that goes for you too. If you see someone else having an issue, you stick behind them and stand up for them.
Thank you. So the next question I have is for Lauren. And, many museum workers right now are unemployed because of COVID. And as we've already kind of alluded to, there's a lot of ambiguity and even fear around what applicants can ask about wages during the interview process. So what should job seekers keep in mind during their search? And what types of questions should they ask their potential employers?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, if anyone out here is a hiring manager, put the salary in the frickin' job description, you guys. It makes me crazy when we're not able to do that, because I think people don't work for a place out of the goodness of their hearts. As much as we would love to think it, and as much as everyone would love to be altruistic, I'm sorry, no, pay me the money that I am worth. And so I think you wind up getting frustrated as a manager, as a hiring manager, if you have to be super cagey about how you're hiring, because you've wasted both your time and, more importantly, you've wasted the applicant's time, because if they go through a lengthy interview process, and we all know that museum interview processes can be crazy, crazy long, if you can't come to an understanding on salary at the very end because nobody was brave enough to have that conversation, then that's so demoralizing for everyone. So I'm dismounting from my soapbox, but if you're a hiring manager, just put the frickin' salary in the job description. Anyway, so to talk more about what you guys as job seekers would have in terms of power, you got a lot, which is really great. So there's, again, some new laws that just came down the pike pretty recently. You are no longer required to put your previous salary in an application, or you're not required to disclose any previous salary, because what people were finding was that was kind of suppressing salaries kind of across the board. So people should know what they're willing to pay for a position, not how little can I get away with. And I'll tell you a quick story about that. So I went to work for a museum, and I was pretty new to the museum industry at the time, and I got an offer, and it was more than what I was making, and I was like, this is great, I got way more than I thought I was getting, and everything's good. And then I happened to see on my boss's screen what he had been planning to pay in terms of a range for the salary, and I, by not negotiating, tucked myself out of $20,000. And it's taken me a really long time to claw that money back over the course of several years. So the other great thing that I think you guys need to know about is that there's another law that says if a job seeker asks what the range is for a position, we got to tell them. and there's no reason not to. So the best thing to do, again, is just put it in the job description. And I know it's scary, and it's really scary, especially if you're looking for a job and you don't already have a job, to feel like you're pushing on this. But one of the things that I think can be really helpful is to kind of take the hiring manager as a partner in this and say, so if somebody pushes back on you and says like, oh no, I need to know like what you were making your old job before we can figure out if it makes sense for you to come here. Something that sometimes is helpful is to say like, oh, well, I'm not sure if you're aware, but there was a new law that just came out, and it all goes back to equity and diversity and inclusion, and making sure that underrepresented communities aren't systematically left out of promotions and hiring. So we're actually not allowed to ask that anymore. So again, you're not being like super adversarial about it, but I think sometimes it's not that people are like mustache twirling evil, it's that they just don't know, because nobody has time, except they do have time, they just choose not to. But for this sake, let's say nobody has time to dig into all of the updates to labor laws, and it's something that sometimes HR will make sure that the person doing the interviews is aware of. Sometimes they won't. I mean, I'm, again, super lucky. I have an amazing HR team who, before every interview, is like, here's the stuff that you should know. But not every place has that. So it's not necessarily coming from a bad place. It's coming from a place of ignorance. And so we can work with that. And then I think also the other thing, and again, this is easier said than done when you're looking for a job and you don't already have one, but interviewing is a two-way street. You are interviewing the museum or the company as much as they are interviewing you. You want to make sure it's a good fit on both sides, because the last thing as a hiring manager that I would want is somebody to take a job, hate it, and feel super, super demoralized. That's just not good for anyone. So, take the time, ask the questions, really dig into it. I would say also check GuideStar. If you guys are not familiar with GuideStar, you can look at the tax filings for every nonprofit. Museums are nonprofits. So take a look and see what other people are making, what their top 5 highest paid people are making. Look at who their contractors are. Who are they paying money to? Are they paying money to architects for renovations when they could be paying that to salaries? Like, take a look at that and see what the overall health of the organization looks like. And I can talk about this for like hours and hours and hours, but I think those are some good tips to just kind of start with.
Great, thanks, Lauren. Cody or Nat, do you have anything that you'd like to add on to what Lauren's already said?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in if I could. So kind of the first thing that I'd like to really, really focus in on that Lauren kind of brought up was just kind of bring it up, especially with the new law where they have to give you the range. In my experience, almost every single person I've ever worked with who like questioned the rate they got, and they're like, hey, actually, I need this much, or hey, actually, like this is the going rate in the industry. I know, at the Children's Museum, our graphic designer, their big thing with that position was our last person basically came in and told them, well, this is kind of the rate I've been getting, like that's a good salary range, but this is the rate I've been getting at all the other jobs. And now they're very, very focused on, we need to maintain market value for the graphic designer position. Just because someone brought it up and they're like, I don't know how many graphic designers you're going to get paying this, and they're very aware of that now. And I've seen this in like multiple other jobs, right? It's always the person who asks who gets it. And so this kind of goes back to the idea of, just talk about it, right? Kind of, I know it's uncomfortable and it feels awkward sometimes, but I think it's almost more awkward being in like that long interview process and getting to like the second or third interview and still being like, what's going on with the pay? I don't know if it's worth it. So that would be my big tip there, is really just ask. If it doesn't seem fair, tell them like, hey, this is how much I need to be making, and if they can't pay it, there's obviously going to be a better job out there for you who will pay you what you need to be paid. And then on that as well, I really like Lauren's statement that your boss isn't like mustache twirling evil. I think that's really dead on. That's something I really came to realize in just through contract negotiations, right? I don't think people necessarily have like this idea of like, I want to like screw people out of what they're getting. I think it's a very kind of like built-in like business response almost. And the example I like to think of is just the statement, I want to pay them what they're worth, right? And so if we look at that from the direction of an employee, right, going, I want to make sure I get paid what I'm worth. It's, you know, very growth oriented. They feel like they're not getting paid enough and they want to make sure and secure the amount they need to live. But if you hear that from the employer side, well, we just want to make sure that we're paying them what they're worth. It's kind of reductive, right? And I think it's just that clash of interests there. And so we need to look at, you know, how do we rectify these interests? It's very transactional, it feels like, when it's thought of that way. And so I think it's really, really important to have that conversation and realize, like, I need to advocate for myself, because if I'm not, the way that relationship is, you know, they're going to try to reduce it because they think I'm trying to pay them what they're worth, like market value. And so you need to be the one who's actively standing up for your own rights and, you know, your own pay, your own benefits, and you have to advocate for those. Otherwise, nobody else is going to. And like you said, they're not mustache twirling evil. They're just trying to make sure that, you know, the museum, they have a very focused way of looking at the museum's finances, or, you know, the job site's finances. And it's more like having horse blinders on than it is like, yeah, being evil about it, you know?
Cody, I think that's a great point. I agree with you completely on everything you said. And I think just tagging in also, so bringing it up is always really scary. I think asking for a range before your interview or during your first phone interview makes total sense. But here's the other fun trick is, once somebody's decided that they really like you and they want to hire you, your bargaining power just went up again. So that's when you kind of can dig in a little bit more to like, okay, so you've given me this range from like X to Z. I'd like to start at least at Y and then work my way up. How does that sound? So if they offer you something within the range, but like on the low end of the range, and you can put together a great business case for why you should be paid toward the higher end of the range, throw it at them. And then the last thing I would say, back to Cody's point, is, you know, just because we talk about paying people what they're worth, I think I would encourage anyone who does hiring to think of it as, you're going to get the amount of work out of them that it makes sense based on their salary. And we're not saying work people to the bone, but I'm just saying, like, you will get happier employees, you'll get a longer retention rate if you are able to pay them what they have shown that they are worth, which is usually higher than what we have planned to pay. And I think, you know, because of that, it may feel like we're paying more money in the short run, but really what's happening is we're actually saving a bunch of money in terms of not having to constantly turn people over and you know, get new uniforms for new staff and like retraining and all of that. If you can get longevity in your staff and they're happy and they want to stay with you for a long time, that is gold, and you'll save so much money doing that.
And honestly, just to add one thing to that, so in contract negotiations, right, I have to really dig into the finances and kind of calculate out both of our proposals. And I've been really digging into these numbers. And one thing I found out is with the retention rate, at least for our institution, you know, we're relatively small, but still I think it kind of applies and is a good food for thought for people. It costs about the yearly salary to constantly be retraining people and re-onboarding people. It costs about the yearly salary for that one person of about 3 people, right? So every time you retrain people, you're really paying 3 people's salaries for 1 year just to get that one person up to speed. So you're just sinking money. And if you have a retention rate where it's, you know, 30, 40, 50% of your frontline staff every year, every 6 months are out of there, that's huge amounts of money. You're basically just throwing buckets of money out the window every time you have to retrain people like that. And there's a lot of really, really interesting like ways stuff like that works out in the numbers when you actually get down into the down and dirty of the numbers and look at it.
That's really interesting, Cody. I did not know that, but it makes total sense. And, you know, it just makes economic sense to try to hire people and incentivize them to stay. Nat, do you have anything you want to add on to this discussion before we go on to the next question?
No, I think Cody and Lauren answered so beautifully, and I learned so much.
Okay, well, then let's move on a bit to Cody. Do you think you could talk a bit more detail about why you and your colleagues at the New Children's Museum unionized? And perhaps you could also explain, you know, what a union is and what the unionization process looks like.
Yeah, so the best way I could explain kind of what a union is for somebody who doesn't know what one is, going back to kind of the last question, that discussion we were having about how to have that discussion about wages or, you know, benefits and stuff. Realistically, what the union is it's all the workers coming together to say, we're going to have, you know, we want to have a voice in our contract. We want to have a voice in that discussion. And it's basically all the workers, you know, basically pulling a seat up to the table. With us, we have representatives. So I was elected by the teaching artist team. That's one of our 3 frontline teams, to represent, you know, my department on our bargaining committee, who sits across from our executive team and negotiates a contract with them. And so that contract lasts for, you know, a set amount of years. And so really why we did it, you know, pay is always part of it. But for us, the bigger thing was kind of transparency and like dissemination of information. There is a really big issue for us in that, you know, we would have these conversations. And like I said before, we would all talk about it, what we would do, how we could fix these things. And because we're on the floor and we see how things work and how to interact, we have a really, really good working idea of how to do a quick fix, how to, you know, make a program work a little bit better. And it constantly felt like we would come up with all these ideas and we'd present them to our managers and they'd be like, okay, we're going to pass them up the ladder. And then nothing would happen. And it would just, you know, week would go by, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and we wouldn't hear anything. And this became a fairly consistent issue, where it came to the point where we were just kind of like, okay, well, if we can't get anything fixed and it's really starting to be demoralizing to the people working, and getting to the point where people feel like we have little to no decision-making power in what we actually do day to day. Yeah, we kind of were just like, well, what's the best thing we could do to open up a conversation? And, you know, it was unionize. The union is the traditional way that you sit down and you advocate for a worker's right across from, you know, the people who operate the business. And really, in my mind, it's more of a vehicle just for the workers to kind of have legitimacy, just because that social relation of like workers and employees, at least in America, that imbalance is kind of off, right? Kind of that's what this whole program is about. The workers don't really have a voice to make that change. And unions, like I said, historically have been the vehicle for that change. So for us, kind of the way it starts is just by finding interest. You talk with your coworkers, kind of find out what all the issues are. And then you petition the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, for an election. You can do this through a like established union. So we organized with IBEW 465, which is the electrical workers. And this is a really big point here. Any group of workers can join any union in the country, right? So on the East Coast, a lot of museum workers are actually represented by the Auto Workers Union. We're represented by the Electrical Workers Union. And for us, kind of the big thing there was we just wanted to find a union that was progressive in kind of the way it was operating, had kind of younger people at the helm of it, and we felt like wasn't going to trample what we wanted. We wanted kind of a partner, not necessarily somebody who was going to like take the lead on everything. We wanted it to be our union, you know? And so from there, you petition for an election. You vote to certify the union. So I believe it's 50% plus 1 is all you need to pass. And so have an election, and then once you have the election, the union is ratified, and from there you start drafting a contract and you go into negotiations. And that's kind of where we've been for the last few months now. I helped write the first draft of our contract. We've kind of been going back and forth with our executive team for a few months now in negotiations, and we're starting to come to a close now. We're really just focused on like wages and benefits now. So the real meat and potatoes of it, but everything else is all ready to go, really.
Okay, thanks, Cody. And how long did that application process, how long did that take?
So this is kind of the big thing, right? It sounds like a lot of work, and it was interestingly very quick. So the longest part in all of this has probably been negotiations. The second longest was probably organizing and talking to all the workers. And it's kind of, like we talked about earlier, we started small, had a few coworkers that we knew would be interested and talked to them. And then we kind of slowly went out and out and out until we talked to just about everybody that we worked with, brought them on board. And that probably took the second longest, maybe like 3-4 months, I'd say. And then, but the actual certification process, it's within, I think, a month of certifying you. They have to have an election. It's part of the National Labor Relations Act, which is the piece of legislation that basically, oversees unions in America. So within a month, we, after we got everybody to sign the cards, basically 1 month later, we had an election and we were certified, and we've been in negotiations ever since. So the actual like forming the union, it's not super hard, really. All it is you have a conversation with your coworkers, decide that this is what you want to do, get people to sign some cards, and vote. Really, really easy. But the big part of that is you have to have those conversations. And like Nat said earlier, that's not always a safe thing to do. So we really, really took our time on that. We probably could have been quicker in, talking with people, reaching out and doing all that, but we really wanted to take our time and make sure that this was something that we'd be able to see come to fruition. So.
Great, interesting. Lauren and Nat, do you have anything that you'd like to say on this topic before we move on? Or if either of you have any questions for Cody?
I actually put it in the chat just because I was curious, because I've been talking to a bunch of different people who are working with different unions. Like, what happens if you want to switch? Like, once you sign with a union and join a union, are you stuck with them like in perpetuity? Or if you decide like they're not actually meeting your needs, can you switch it up?
I don't know off the top of my head. I would definitely assume so from everything I've seen and like the trainings I've done, that the contract itself is like negotiated on your behalf by the union technically. But realistically, we can kind of pick up and go at any time. Like once we sign, especially now, right? So between certifying the election and forming the union, you're not actually in the union until you ratify the contract, get that all squared away, and sign your actual union card, right? So right now, realistically, if we felt like, oh, the IBEW isn't a good fit for us, it would be pretty easy for us to just kind of take a draft of our contract and move along. And honestly, also a big way in America that a lot of unions have been formed have been more independently minded unions. So like the IBEW or the IWW is always out there as an alternative for people who want to take a more independent route with the unionization efforts. I know that there's, I want to say it's Voodoo Donuts in Portland is unionized independently, and they basically oversee everything. But really the benefit to having the more, like the larger institution there of like the IBEW or the auto workers is that they have a foundation there that for you to pull from, right? So if we need a lawyer for negotiations to sit with us, it's really easy for them to just bring their lawyer in. Whereas if we were doing it more independently, then we would have to fund all that ourselves. So.
Thanks for going into more detail on that. So let's move on. So as a reminder, please ask your questions in the chat. And after about one, maybe two more questions, depending on timing here, but after that, we are going to transition over to our audience Q&A. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to submit them into the chat. Moving on, Nat, I wanted to ask this question to you. How can staff advocate for themselves and their fellow colleagues, especially frontline workers who make up the most diverse segment of the museum workforce?
Right. So we know that we deserve better wages. We know we deserve better benefits, but we also know the museum can give us those things. So directors have been taking like 15, 20% pay cuts, but they're still sitting on these lush salaries on the high end of six figures, while workers are getting laid off en masse, and that's not enough. You're absolutely right that frontline, meaning guest services, call center, custodial, retail, maintenance, and food service, make up the most diverse sector of every museum, and they are paid the absolute least. They're also the lifeblood of the museum, the public face of the museum, literally essential to its function. And we've also been the first on the chopping block when it comes to layoffs, furloughs, and pay cuts. I know some of my coworkers had put in like decades of service, and to be so unceremoniously let go just makes my blood boil. And speaking of things that make my blood boil, a lot of these vague, we'll do better, so-called solidarity statements in the wake of this summer's rebellion in response to the state and sanctioned murder of George Floyd and so many others, it's not enough, especially when you consider the institutions that have acted as agents of white supremacy and colonialism historically, and also in the present day. Many workers of color, and more specifically Black women, have put themselves at great risk to publicly call out racism that they've experienced or been witness to. So we need to stand in support of those that are speaking out publicly. Following any action items they give you, writing letters is a great way to let museums know what you're upset about. Write a letter to the director and express solidarity with the workers that are being either laid off or coming out with criticisms and demand change. I know a couple people local to the Bay Area, Taylor Brandon, curator at SF MoMA, righteously called out the museum for being very performative in their statement about the uprising. They basically took this work by Glenn Lagan, one of the Black artists that they have in their collection, totally without his permission, without his knowledge, and use it to make some vague platitude about Black Lives Matter on Instagram, and really promise no material change. It was just, we're gonna think really hard about this. And Brandon commented with her account of the many times she was harassed and basically said this was incredibly hypocritical. And they responded by silencing her and deleting her comments. And so a lot of people rallied around her and supported her in writing open letters to the museum director. And that was very effective, I think. And in terms of also protesting, getting out in front of SF MoMA. Another SF museum here, the Exploratorium, was put on blast recently in an open letter by Amanda Siegel, which I encourage all of you to read. It recounts the many examples of racist aggression she's faced in her almost decade at the Exploratorium. Probably the most egregious example in the letter is the time she took a nap in a break room and they assumed she was homeless and had stolen someone's badge and snuck in and tried to have her removed. And then another incident that she faced was being a physical altercation with a higher up white woman. So she wrote this open letter, and recently before the stay-at-home order, she and I held a protest on Pier 15. They actually called the cops on us, which is not only a really bad look, but it put us in incredible danger. So yeah, once it's safe to do so, we will be out in the streets. We'll keep protesting this, both wage inequality and racism. Because it's not an isolated issue. It's not just some museums that have this problem. It's our entire society. It's the fabric of our society, and it manifests in all aspects of that. But yeah, in the meantime, keep an ear to the ground. We are working on some virtual actions, probably like a Zoom webinar to talk about this coming in the near future. So I hope to see some of y'all there.
Okay, that open letter sounds really powerful. Where can people find that?
So you can find that on Amanda's Instagram page. I can also maybe email it out to y'all to share with everyone. Her Instagram page is at Siegel_press. Siegel like the bird, but her name is Siegel. It's kind of play on words. But check that out. I can also send it to you after this. And I know I see some Exploratorium Union people in the chat, so it's great to have y'all here.
Yeah, we'd definitely love to have that so we can share it out with everybody. Lauren and Cody, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would say, going back to everything that Nat said, make it as public as you can. If things are truly bad and you've tried to advocate and you're getting nowhere and people are telling you to sit down and not worry your pretty little heads about it, make it public, make it visitor facing, not necessarily in a hostile way, but just like, hey, you guys should know who you're supporting by visiting these museums. And I think that really goes a long way. I think, you know, I'm really deep into all of the Instagrams that have come out over the last, you know, 6 months or so, Change the Museum. Like all of the gallery ones in particular have been really fun to read through. And there are stories that I'm reading that I'm like, oh yeah, that was terrible. And that should, you know, get more of a spotlight shined on it. So, and I do that for every museum that I'm planning to visit also. Like that's something that I really dig into. And I think there are other people who want to kind of support things that they care about. So I would say make it public facing. Don't start off necessarily hostile. But if you're not getting anywhere, then I think it is absolutely fine to make it as public as possible, because you're not the ones who are kind of behaving badly. It's the institutions who really have some reflection to do and some change to work through. And if you are on the admin side, sit with your discomfort. Just sit with it, live with it, figure out why you're feeling uncomfortable, because if you're not feeling uncomfortable, then you're not doing hard enough work.
Yeah, I honestly can't do anything but second everything both of them just said. I know for us, in the wake of the protests and the uprisings and everything, our museum also kind of had a lackluster response and focused on like a small amount of property damage that was sustained by our museum. And so us as the volunteer organizing committee, we used our platform because we have a fairly robust social media presence. And so we, you know, used that platform because we knew we had that voice there to say something and make it public. And it attracted a good amount of attention. It got, you know, the museum to rectify that. And it was a fairly easy push, right? And I think this kind of goes back to the heart of what I was saying at the beginning, right? Just making your voice be heard, right? Unless you say something, nobody's going to know that there is an issue. And it all comes down to, you have to let people know, like, this is not okay. This is not enough. This is what we need you to do. And a lot of times it feels, at least for us in, you know, situations like that, a lot of times it feels like using media pressure is like a pretty advantageous way to kind of apply pressure, you know. But like Lauren said, I think it's really important to, you know, not make it like combative. I think sometimes you need to be a little bit aggressive and say, this is not okay. But I don't think you should come out like actively combative against the institution, right? I know for me, it's not so much something like that, right? We're not trying to call them out to sling mud, to, you know, like hurt the image of the museum or anything. We say it because we really care, and we want the museum to live up to the standards that it sets for, you know, that it says it sets for itself, and we want it to live up to the mission.
So thank you all. So that is the last of our moderated questions. We're running right on schedule, so that's great. Nalini, I think you have ready some questions from the audience.
Yes, can I unmute myself now? Hi, everyone. I'm Nalini. Yes, I have a couple of questions. Thank you, everyone, for participating in the chat and putting in your questions, and also to the panelists for participating, but also responding some of the questions. Let's see. So just going back to the initial topics, the first question that came up was if there's any suggestion for hiring managers who are trying to advocate to HR to change the policies and to get salary information disclosed on the job postings. What can hiring managers do to get that done, or how can would they get in trouble also if they just disclose it on their own?
Well, look, I'm not going to say that nobody's going to get in trouble, but I mean, really, it's the law. Like, they are honestly just following what the law says that they have to do. If they are asked, they have to disclose. That is what California says. But I think like HR is supposed to know all of this. HR sometimes does not. And you know, rather than dig into the whys behind it, sometimes it's just, again, helpful to just take them as a partner, and just say, look, like, you are going to save yourselves so much work, you're going to save us so much work if we can just post the salary information as early as possible. We'll have to disclose it if somebody asks anyway, so why not just get out in front of it? And if it's, I mean, if it's, and kind of like, maybe if you have a relationship with HR, kind of like dig in and figure out, like, where is the hesitation coming from? Is it like, well, we've always done it this way? Or is it like, we know we pay below market rate? Because those are two very different problems. And just, I mean, I always like to do what I call staying in discovery mode. So I, rather than kind of like beat them relentlessly with, we must do it this way, I like to find out why. Like, walk me through this. Like, where is this policy coming from? Why do we have this policy? When was this policy made? Is it something that maybe is outdated and we don't need it anymore? Is it potentially causing us to hire in a way that could be perceived as racist or biased, or, you know, any of those types of things? Like, are you, you know, if by not posting the salary, it means that you're getting people who can afford to work for below minimum wage, what that means is that you're going to get people who have other sources of income to support them, most of whom tend to be white people. So I think really looking at it from, yes, it feels weird, I know it's new, but we're going to save ourselves a whole heap of trouble down the line if we just get on board with this. And I think also reach out to other hiring managers who you know and who are posting this, and just kind of push back and just say, like, this is actually what the more progressive institutions are doing, and this is the result they've gotten. They've gotten better candidates out of it. They've gotten like longevity out of it. And I'm happy to share a lot of our results as much as we have, and I'm sure other people on this call who are hiring managers will be happy to share that as well.
Thank you. Let's see. Another question is also about applying for jobs. So, for example, so how do you work around these bigger museums who are advertising for positions, but they don't really qualify external candidates who probably are not from the museum industry? Especially, you know, the larger museum. So how can someone deal with that and work around that?
If that's for me again, I think it goes back to the same issue, which is you've got an appearance of bias when you do that. And even if you are, you know, as pure as the driven snow about it, you still have that appearance of being biased by not looking at external candidates or looking at comparable experience that maybe is not the same education experience. But maybe there's something else to look at. So I think, you know, again, I would encourage you guys to talk to HR about it in a collaborative way and just say, like, we can get ourselves into a really bad situation with this, especially in this environment, especially because so much is now, you know, people are being so much more transparent about it. and that's not the institution that we want to be in. We know that's not the institution we want to be. So here's a really easy fix for it. And again, like, sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't. Sometimes people will absolutely dig in their heels, but at least this way you can say you've tried. And if it turns out that that's not an institution that really makes sense for you, I'm going to be doing a bunch of hiring soon. So come work with me instead.
Okay, let's see. Okay, so this one is about unions. So maybe Cody can start with this. So what are some aspects of transparency that unionization offers? And also, if forming a union isn't an option because there's roadblocks within the union itself, do you have any suggestions for alternative methods of advocating for and organizing workers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so just starting at the beginning there, right? So what sort of transparency can unions bring? I think the big thing is it really helps get and I hate saying it like legitimizes the worker's voice, you know, because I feel like people who work at an institution should just be able to like have an open conversation about this, but it allows people lower down the totem pole to kind of sit and talk on even footing with the people all the way at the top of the institution. So a good example of this, kind of going back to hiring practices even. So for something like that, right, we've been talking for a while, like, hey, for, you know, entry-level positions, it's weird that we should have like a college degree requirement, or, you know, something like that, right? And this is something we're able to have a conversation about. Another big one was our job didn't have job descriptions for every single job, just because, you know, someone would get promoted into like a senior position and they never make the job description for the senior position. Those people would get more and more and more work piled on because there's no set boundaries to what their job actually is. So, you know, just by being a union, we were able to go, well, hold on there. We need job descriptions for every job. And they go, okay, here they are. And we're able to ask, well, where are the senior ones? They go, oh, well, we don't have those. Okay, well, let's sit down. Let's talk about that. What does that look like? This is what those workers have been facing. You know, this is the issue they had. How do we address that? And even going forward past the actual like negotiation process, something that I'm really excited about, we formed with them in our main contract, we wrote in an actual labor management committee, right? So there's a committee that'll meet a few times a month, and HR will be involved, a senior manager will be involved, and representatives of the workers will also be there. And it basically gives us a forum, you know, to meet every so often and go, hey, these are the things that we're facing, and them to go, okay, what can we do about it? And then we can sit down and kind of come out with a game plan for how do we address these things now, instead of us constantly trying to pass these issues up the totem pole only to get no response. We now have an actionable way to kind of keep them accountable to that as well, right? So we're able to have the conversation, make sure it gets implemented. So that, I think, is the biggest thing, is it just allows us to have those conversations on equal footing, and then also allows us to make sure that those fixes get implemented, which I think is really the big thing there, right? You can have all the transparency in the world and know why things are, you know, working the way they do, but if those things are still an issue and there's no actionable way to change them, you know, it's all for naught, really, in my mind. So that would be my big thing there. And then the second part of the question, could you just repeat it for me real quick?
Yes. So let me see. Do you have any suggestions for alternative methods of advocating for and organizing workers? Like, is there also a network that exists for organizing efforts outside of a national union membership?
So not really. I think this is one of the things that is really lacking just in America because of kind of the demonization of unions over the past, you know, 50 or so years. Since the 1930s, we've seen a huge decline in union membership in America. And with that kind of comes the like degradation of that kind of informational infrastructure. I think the best thing you could do if you can't organize in your workplace is to organize online, kind of like Nat did. Start a blog, start an Instagram page, right? What is Instagram but advertising, right? Most people just use it to advertise themselves to their friends so they can look at their pictures. But realistically, if you have these ideas and you want to make change, social media is a great way to make social change. I think, you know, the 2016 election kind of proved that, right? Like social media has a huge impact on the political landscape of not just our country, but the world. And I think with that, we can use that infrastructure to start building those networks. But right now, there is no real strong unified network of people around which you can organize. My best tip for you would be to reach out to other political organizations you're really like passionate about. So I've seen a couple of people mention the DSA in chat. DSA is a great one. Getting involved in other progressive platforms, other political parties like the PSL is a great one to reach out to. But just finding other organizations that are already out there doing work, kind of in the community, you can work with them. And if at the end of the day, none of that is available to you, literally just talking on social media, being vocal about these things, starting Facebook groups and, you know, getting people in there to start discussing things, all great ideas and very, very, very valuable. If there was a United Museum Workers like rant page, you'd probably see so much just solidarity in the industry nationwide, right? And that it's really that simple, right? Is just give people a platform to talk.
Thank you. Let's see. So this question can be for any of you. Do you have any advice on how to advocate for yourself during this crisis when many small and mid-sized museums are struggling financially?
Yeah, so there's an incredible thread. I believe it's linked on the Cultural Connections website. If you want to check that out, there's an incredible list of museums that was compiled by @JessDJefferson on Twitter and Instagram. And she compiled a bunch of Black-run museums that celebrate Black art, culture, history, that really are in need of help. So if you are able to donate, that would be wonderful. And kind of to go back to the last question just a little bit, I second everything that Cody said. While there's nothing as good as a union in terms of worker protection, they really do utilize social media. They're incredible. They change the museums. There's so cancel art galleries. There's so many accounts. Museum Workers Speak is a mutual aid network. There's so many things you can do to organize without a union. If you don't have one like I do, or if you want to start one. And a lot of these things, like getting involved with the struggle, like people have mentioned the DSA and the PSL, getting involved with community organizations and mutual aid networks is one of the best things you can do to develop a network of like-minded people that want to change the world, that maybe don't work in museums or maybe work in other nonprofits. And yeah, do skill shares and build really the skills you need. So whenever a unionization becomes more feasible for you, you will have those skills to back that up and have the skills to take it to the completion. And I also like what Cody said earlier is like, getting to the unionization part is actually the easy part of the job. Once you have the union, it's not like, everything's great, everything's wonderful, we have equality now. No, that's when the struggle really begins, because then that gives you the vehicle, I think is what the word you use, vehicle or tool, to actually be able to take on and negotiate for yourself.
No, 100%. If I could say one thing, it's definitely the work begins kind of after you organize. It was really fun writing the contract, but negotiating it is a completely different conversation.
It's easy to think of all the things you want.
And I think that's really, really important, right? And I think this kind of is just a general negotiation tactic that I would love to see like progressive politicians use more often. But like with our first contract, right? We wrote it from a perspective of this is what we think we need to be at to be in a good place, right? We kind of shot for the moon, but we knew that we'd, land amongst the stars, as the saying goes. And I think that's really, really important, is not to just put out kind of half measures. Like I said, use social media, but don't get stuck at like just using social media. I think the end goal should always be try to unionize once you can, because the union is always going to be the most actual, movement and power you'll be able to get. If you don't have the union there, you're going to see very little impact. But that doesn't mean all those other smaller things you can't do don't carry weight with them.
Yeah, I think that's so important. Don't stop at social media. As someone who is, trying to use social media as a tool to achieve a lot of the goals that we've talked about, if you stop at social media, all you are is just sitting on your soapbox talking to a few people. You got to do the work. You got to be out in the streets. You got to write the emails, all of that stuff. It takes a lot of work. Unionizing sounds maybe a little bit more glamorous than it maybe is, but it's a lot of tough work, but it's so, so worth it.
It's definitely nice. I'll end this question on this, but it's definitely nice waking up every day. And, I've been laid off for a good amount of time now. But it's been nice being like, okay, so-and-so still needs help with rental assistance. Okay, so I'm going to drive over to his house today and I'm going to help him get, it's like an older man who's not good with computers, doesn't own one. So I go over there and like help him get signed up with rental assistance. Like, okay, another thing checked off. Now I got to check my email. Okay, I have to prep for the cultural connections talk. And there's like legwork there, but it's all really fulfilling work, which helps it not feel like work,
Definitely. Okay, so we have
Nalini, if I can just jump in real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
This will be our last audience Q&A question after the one that you have prepared. And then we'll move into closing comments, and then we can start our breakout rooms.
Yes, thank you, Morgan. Okay, so this one last question from the audience. Can any of you share any good models in the field for frontline staff in the way of wages, benefits, professional growth, etc., or any ideas on what that might look like?
So my first kind of thought on this is, I think it's really dependent on each museum, right? And each institution, each workplace. I think the important thing about wage equity versus wage equality, right? So with equality, it's even across the board, where equity kind of takes into account the differences between people, and in this case, institutions, right? So what might be equitable for one institution might not be equitable for another. And I think it's really, really important to look at kind of what's actually going on with each museum. But with that being said, right, the absolute cheapest investment, and this is going back to my experience, crunching the numbers in our wage negotiation, the absolute cheapest investment in labor that an institution can make, or any workplace can make really, is in those frontline staff. It's always going to be more expensive to increase the pay of somebody at the upper end. And usually this is because when we think of pay increases, it's usually some percentage amount. So with a percentage, the people who are already making more are going to see a higher increase, right? So at the bottom, I only make $18,000 a year. So if you increase my pay to $24,000, and my take home's now $24,000, that's going to have a huge impact on me compared to if you give that same percentage increase to, one of the senior managers or someone like that. It's bound to cost you, 10, 12, 15, 18 grand. And that was one thing that really, really stood out to me, was just the absolute cheapest thing you can do is pay your frontline workers more. Like, it's the easiest investment that any workplace can make. And I think it goes to show a lot of like almost malpractice, and like it shows that people aren't being thoughtful, right? When they are refusing to pay frontline workers more when people are fighting for $15 an hour, right? That's literally the cheapest place to invest money for you. So
one thing I'd love
oh, go ahead. No, I'm sorry.
I'd love to add if you've heard of the Mass Action Toolkit, it stands for Museums as a Site for Social Action. No, something like that. It was developed by Latanya Autry of Art Stuff Matters. It's an incredible resource and it's free. That's the important thing. It's free. So check that out. I know Cultural Connections did a webinar thing, or maybe it was in person. I don't remember. That was so long ago. But check it out. Definitely. Yes. museumaction.org. Lauren got me in the comments.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nat. I agree that that's a really, really fantastic resource, and the fact that people are making them all open and free is huge. I think also the going back to what Cody was saying about the most economic investment you can make is in frontline staff, that is absolutely true. And where you're going to get pushback on that is the number, because it's not just one person's salary. It's sometimes, you know, in my case, it's going to be like 90 people's salaries that have to go up. It's still cheaper. It's still cheaper. It's still more cost effective across the board. And then the other thing that I will push back on is a lot of museums like to really focus on part-time workers over full-time, because everyone gets out their like best set of clutching pearls when it comes to benefits, and I have no idea why. Because giving workers vacation, giving them paid sick time actually winds up reducing absenteeism in the long run, because they're not coming to work sick and then infecting everybody else. Like, you can stay home and know that you can still pay your bills. And I think also, you know, one of the things that we're looking at is so in my museum, we're focused really heavily on, like, we want a large contingent of full-time frontline staff with benefits, with equity, with 401k, with all of that kind of good stuff. And then we're also looking at some of the non-monetary benefits that can still be really helpful. So for example, looking at offering everyone a shift meal. I don't know if we're going to get there. I'm still in negotiations for it, but it's something that I think a lot of times your frontline team can be food insecure. I know in my early 20s, I absolutely was food insecure at times. It was a question of, can I pay my rent or can I eat? And most of the time I would choose rent. So I think it would be great if, as museums across the board, who all have, or most of whom have, cafes attached to them, can we start living in a world where you know that when you come to work, making sure to pack a lunch or buy a lunch or whatever a lunch is one less thing you have to think about. And I think that, you know, I've costed it out for my team, and I think if we were just to cover it at restaurant cost for everybody in the museum, regardless of position, I think it's like $250,000 a year, which we can find somebody to fund that for us. So reach out to your grant makers, like who handles your development, figure out who's interested in funding this kind of stuff, because right now is a really great time for it. But I would also love to hear from you guys, like, what else would make life better for you at work, in addition to salaries, in addition to benefits? Like, I would love to hear more about that from everyone. So please feel free to reach out to me, and let's figure out how we can start pushing for this together.
If I could just make one more comment, something Lauren said that honestly stuck out to me, and like is my life right now, honestly, is the clutching of the pearls over benefits. So like I said earlier, right, I make $18,000 a year. I'm a frontline worker. My benefit cost right now as part-time, you know, basically just everything that goes into it, is only about $2,000. And to increase my benefits to like the level of everybody else is only like $2,000-3,000 more. And so it's one of those things, again, where with especially healthcare, right? So whose healthcare is the most expensive? Well, it's going to be the oldest people in the institution, who tend to be the people at the top. And so this is something that stuck out to me, whereas like, well, if you have a full-time staff of recent college grads as your frontline staff, their healthcare costs are going to be much, much lower than most of the people in like management, senior management positions. And if you're looking to keep younger people in those positions anyways, you're going to see that, there's kind of a natural progression, right? If there's a job open, someone will move up to it, and now they're in the same kind of bracket that the last person was too, age-wise. But yeah, health benefits, healthcare is a tiny, tiny, tiny part compared to actual wages. And realistically, right, we can't lower wages if people are already struggling to get by, and we shouldn't be like cutting people's benefits. I think a big key thing here is there's kind of this economic orthodoxy of seeing employees as like an overhead cost, something that needs to be endured and is really more just like a money sink on the business. And I think we just absolutely have to change that mentality and like wipe that away. It's an investment. Like people are an investment. It's like buying a new exhibit. You're hoping that you're going to get more people in. Well, if you have good staff, you're going to get more people in. 100% every day of the week.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for all that each of you do. It's incredible, everything that you do. And just one final question. If you could impart one bit of knowledge or actionable item to our audience, what would you say?
And yes, before you all answer that though, I just want to butt in again. Sorry, Nalini. So after this, we are going to transition over to our breakout room. So while our panelists are answering this last question, this would be a great time for you all to list in the chat which panelist breakout room you would like to be in. So just put the name of the panelist that you'd like to join their breakout room for, and we will get it set up for you. Lauren, would you like to start off with your closing comments?
Sure, I can start with closing comments. I think, I love the museum world. I love working with everyone here. This is like my ideal situation, just meeting people that some of you guys who are on this call I've worked with before, some of you guys are new to me. There's so much power in this room. And I think we just need to figure out more ways to talk to each other and not let the institutions, some of whom are very old and outdated, speak for us. And now I'm officially off my soapbox.
Well, if I could take a step onto it for a moment, my number one thing would definitely be never stop talking. The only person who's going to advocate for your rights is yourself. And I think the most important thing you can do is just keep bringing stuff up, even if it's uncomfortable, and keep talking. Obviously, don't do anything that's going to get you like fired. Don't be like super confrontational about things, but always be talking, advocating for the change you want to see. Otherwise, it's never going to come. So that would be my number one thing.
My number one thing would be you cannot organize on your own. That's just a reality. So join a community organization, get out into the streets whenever it's safe to do so. Show them who has the power. There's no shortage of things we can do from home. Until then, write letters, as I mentioned, organize a car caravan, start a petition, start a social media, email, phone blast to draw attention to these issues, and donate and share mutual aid campaigns. I personally, as I mentioned earlier, really admire the work that Museum Workers Speak is doing with their relief fund. They're very close to reaching 100K in funds, and they have been giving out grants, $500 to impacted employees. So I'm going to be donating $100 to them today. I would love to ask that if you have the means to match my donation, to please do so. But honestly, anything helps, even if that's just a few bucks or just a like and a share and a comment. Of course, and also if you're in need of aid, you can totally apply for a link. I think they said it best when they said, it's become clear when our institutions won't stand in solidarity with us, we have to stand in solidarity with one another. And I'll post that link in the comments right now. Oh, and also one last thing, if anybody outside of this would like to get in contact with me, you can email me at seizethemuseums@gmail.com. If you have any questions, I'm happy to brainstorm with you or try to connect you to people, whatever I can do to help.
Thank you so much. And for everyone else, if you want to participate in the breakout rooms, like Morgan said, just make sure to put the name of the panelists that you want to be in the room with, along with other people, to continue the conversation. And that's going to happen exactly at 5:30. Someone will magically transport you to their room and have a conversation for about 20, 25 minutes. Thank you.
And if you're not able to make it into the breakout room, thank you for coming, and I hope you found this interesting and insightful and helpful.